All right, guys, let's continue our exploration of dark romanticism with the story The Birthmark. So, again, we'll do this in the same pattern that we did the other. We'll read a little bit and then we'll discuss to make sure that everything's clear. Sometimes when we read stories that are written a long time ago, the language is a little difficult, right? So, let's take a look at The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne, 1843. A long time ago, there lived a skillful scientist who had experienced a spiritual reaction more striking than any chemical one. He had left his laboratory in the care of his assistant, washed the chemicals from his hands, and asked a beautiful woman to become his wife. In those days, new scientific discoveries, such as electricity, seemed to open paths in the area of miracles. It was not unusual for the love of science to compete with the love of a woman. The scientist's name was Almer. He had so totally given himself to scientific studies that he could not be weakened by a second love. His love for his young wife could only be the stronger of the two if it could link itself with his love of science. Such a union did take place with truly remarkable results. But one day, very soon after their marriage, Almer looked at his wife with a troubled expression. So immediately here, you should be drawing some parallels to the oval portrait. Right? The oval portrait, we have an obsessed, skillful artist, and here we have a skillful scientist who is obsessed with his work. But both of these men end up marrying beautiful women that they have fallen in love with, right? So this is the age of scientific experiment where all paths become open to miracles, right? And he says it was not unusual for the love of science to compete with the love of a woman. So again, we have the competition between the love of the work with the love of the wife. So that happens in the oval portrait too, right? The painter's love for his art versus the love for his wife. So the scientist, Almer, had given himself to scientific studies. He is completely obsessed, and it says he cannot have that love weakened by a second love. So his love for science will not be weakened by his love for his new wife, right? And then he says, however, if he could link his love with his wife to his love of science, then they would be equal. After a few weeks, maybe in their marriage, it says that he's all of a sudden been looking at his wife with a troubled expression. So that's kind of like news for trouble, right? That kind of tells us trouble's on its way. Georgiana, he said, have you ever considered that the mark upon your cheek might be removed? No, she said, smiling. But seeing the seriousness of his question, she said, the mark has so often been called a charm that I was simple enough to imagine it might be so. On another face it might, answered her husband, but not on yours. No, dear, nature made you so perfectly that this small defect shocks me as being a sign of earthly imperfection. Shocks you? Cried Georgiana deeply. Her face reddened, and she burst into tears. Then why did you marry me? You cannot love what shocks you. We must explain that in the center of Georgiana's left cheek there was a mark, deep in her skin. The mark was usually a deep red color. When Georgiana blushed, the mark became less visible. But when she turned pale, there was the mark, like a red stain upon snow. The birthmark would come and go with the emotions in her heart. So let's pause here. There's a little conflict between Almer and Georgiana. So Georgiana has basically a port wine stain. That's what it's called, a birthmark on her face that's red on her cheek. And her husband all of a sudden is bothered by it and wonders, have you ever thought about trying to remove it? And she says, oh, no, I have never thought of that because everybody's always told me it was a charm. And then she says, I was simple enough to imagine it might be true. So here, simple doesn't necessarily mean easy, right? Here, simple means, oh, I was, maybe innocent enough to believe that that was true based on his reaction because he says it shocks him. And she's like, shocks you? Then why did you marry me? Right? All of a sudden now it's a problem, but it wasn't before. But let's talk about this birthmark because they give us, the narrator stops to describe it. And the narrator and the author never stop to give you information unless it matters. If they point something out that otherwise would not matter, it matters. So it's a deep red color. And when she blushes, when she's happy, the mark becomes less visible. But when she is sad or upset and turns pale, the birthmark becomes all the more pronounced and looks like a red stain on snow. So the narrator says to us that the birthmark becomes more and less visible depending on how happy or upset Georgiana is. The mark was shaped like a very small human hand. Georgiana's past lovers used to say that the hand of a magical fairy had touched her face when she was born. Many gentlemen would have risked his life for the honor of kissing that mysterious hand. So many of the men saw it as something like, oh, you've been kissed by magic, right? You have a magical fairy that's touched your face, and they see it as something very special. But other people had different opinions. Some women said the red hand quite destroyed the effect of Georgiana's beauty. Well, that just sounds like jealousy to me. That's like saying, oh, you're super pretty, but this one little thing. That sounds like jealousy to me. Male observers who did not praise the mark simply wished it away so that they did not see it. After his marriage, Almer discovered that this was the case with himself. So again, trouble is boding, right? Had Georgiana been less beautiful, he might have felt his love increased by the prettiness of that little hand. But because she was so otherwise perfect, he found the mark had become unbearable. Almer saw this mark as a sign of his wife's eventual sadness, sickness, and death. Soon, the birthmark caused him more pain than Georgiana's beauty had ever given him pleasure. So it's like the more he focuses on it, the worse it gets, right? So he sees it as the fact that eventually she's going to be sad, sick, or die. And the more he focuses on it, the more pronounced it becomes. Remember, the more he talks about it and upsets Georgiana, the more physically visible it will become, right? During a period that should have been their happiest, Almer could only think of this disastrous subject. With the morning light, Almer opened his eyes upon his wife's face and recognized the sign of imperfection. When they sat together in the evening near the fire, he would look at the mark. So he's becoming obsessed, right? Georgiana soon began to fear his look. His expression would make her face go pale, and the birthmark would stand out like a red jewel on white stone. So again, the narrator keeps reminding us that when Georgiana is upset, she grows pale. And when she grows pale, that birthmark sticks out even more. Well, if she's perceiving that he is unhappy with her, it's going to stick out even more every day, right? Do you remember, dear Almer, about the dream you had last night about this hateful mark? She asked with a weak smile. None whatever, answered Almer, surprised. The mind is in a sad state when sleep cannot control its ghosts and allows them to break free with their secrets. Almer now remembered his dream. He had imagined himself with his assistant, Amidab, trying to remove the birthmark with an operation. But the deeper his knife went, the deeper the small hand sank until it had caught hold of Georgiana's heart. Almer felt guilty remembering the dream. Almer, said Georgiana, I do not know what the cost would be to both of us to remove this birthmark. Removing it could deform my face or damage my health. Dearest Georgiana, I have spent much thought on the subject, said Almer. I am sure it can be removed. Then let the attempt be made at any risk, said Georgiana. Life is not worth living with this hateful mark makes me the object of your horror. You have deep science and have made great discoveries. Remove this little mark for the sake of your peace and my own. Dearest wife, cried Almer, do not doubt my power. I am ready to make this cheek as perfect as its pair. Her husband kissed gently her right cheek, the one without the red hand. So finally, Georgiana says, you got to do something about this. I can't live like this, right? She's like, I have to put you at peace because if you are not at peace, I will not be at peace. So basically, very much like the young woman in the oval portrait, she's kind of giving in to her husband and knowing if this is going to make him happy, she might as well go for it because she's not going to be happy until he is. So Almer, of course, is very excited to use his science on his wife. Remember what it said at the beginning? If he was able to combine his love for science with his love for his wife, and now they can come together. So this is doubly exciting to him. The next day, the couple went to Almer's laboratory where he had made all his famous discoveries. Georgiana would live in a beautiful room he had prepared nearby while he worked tirelessly in his lab. One by one, Almer tries a series of powerful experiments on his wife, but the mark remained. Georgiana waited in her room. She read through his notebooks of scientific observations. She could not help see that many of his experiments had ended in failure. She decided to see for herself the scientist at work. The first thing that struck Georgiana when entering the laboratory was the hot furnace. From the amount of soot above, it seemed to have been burning for ages. She saw machines, tubes, cylinders, and other containers for chemical experiments. What most drew her attention was Almer himself. He was nervous and pale as death as he was working on preparing a liquid. So this is the first time after all this time that he's been working that she's actually gone into the laboratory to see what he's doing, right? She's kind of freaking out a little bit because she sees that a lot of his experiments have ended in failure and what might happen to her, right? Georgiana realized that her husband had been hiding his tension and fear. "Think not so little of me that you cannot be honest about the risks we are taking," she said. "I will drink whatever you make for me, even if it is a poison." "My dear, nothing shall be hidden," Almer said. "I have already given you chemicals power enough to change your entire physical system. Only one thing remains to be tried, and if that fails, we are ruined." So take a second and think about how that might make her feel. If we can't get this birthmark off your face, we are ruined. He led her back to her room where she waited once more, alone with her thoughts. She hoped that for just one moment she could satisfy her husband's highest ideals. But she realized that when his mind would forever be on the march, always requiring something newer, better, and more perfect. So she's hoping that getting rid of this birthmark is going to fix this scientific drive to always be experimenting and fixing things. But then she realizes that his mind would forever be on the march. He's always going to be looking for something to do with science. He's always going to be looking for something newer, better, and more perfect in his science, whether it's her birthmark or something else. Hours later, Alma returned carrying a crystal glass with a colorless liquid. "The chemical process went perfectly," he said. "Unless all my science has tricked me, it cannot fail." To test the liquid, he placed a drop in the soil of a dying flower growing in a pot in the room. In a few minutes, the plant became healthy and green once more. So if it makes something that's dead healthy and green, what is it going to do to something that's vibrant and alive? "I do not need proof," Georgiana said quietly. "Give me the glass. I am happy to put my life in your hands." She drank the liquid and immediately fell asleep. Almer sat next to his wife, observing her and taking notes. He noted everything, her breathing, the movement of an eyelid. He stared at the birthmark. And slowly, with every breath that came and went, it lost some of its brightness. "By heaven, it is nearly gone," said Almer. "Success! Success!" He opened the window coverings to see her face in daylight. She was so pale. Georgiana opened her eyes and looked into the mirror her husband held. She tried to smile as she saw the barely visible mark. "My poor Almer," she said gently, "you have aimed so high. With so high and pure feeling, you have rejected the best the earth could offer. I am dying, dearest." It was true. The hand on her face had been her link to life. As the last trace of color disappeared from her cheek, she gave her last breath. Blinded by a meaningless imperfection and impossible goal, Almer had thrown away her life and with it his chance for happiness. In trying to improve his lovely wife, he had failed to realize she had been perfect all along. So here we have a very similar situation, right? Losing focus on what really matters for small things. And in both stories, that love of the job, whether it was artistry or science, competed with the love of the wives.